Okay, thank you all for coming out in this intimidating weather. I'm Summer, I'm the curator here at the museum. Before we get started, everybody please take a second to turn off or silence your cell phone so we don't have any disruptions. Oh, I forgot my prep. We have a scavenger hunt on sale. It's called Momentous Moments. It's $15 and it's fun for all ages. So if you're interested in buying one, contact Thea for more information. Her card is at that back table. And while there was no Shrimp Fest this year, we are going to be participating in Falling for Shrimp on October 1st through the 3rd. So just like Shrimp Fest, we will have a booth outside the palace and we'll be serving our spicy pirate gumbo. So come see us for that or sign up to volunteer if you're interested. As for upcoming programs, our July 3rd on the 16th will be with Caitlin Hoff-Mahoney from the Matheson Museum in Gainesville. She's going to be talking about the Johns Committee in Florida. And then our August Brown Bag Lunch on the 4th will be with archaeologist Mark Thompson, who will demonstrate the ancient practice of producing stone tools. Also, if you have an evaluation sheet at your table or near you, please fill it out at the end of the program and then put it in that basket at the back. So that's it for me, but today we have Francis Flood. Francis was a social studies teacher in Nassau County Schools from 1968 to 72. He then served as executive director for ARC Nassau for 10 years and served as an advocate for people with developmental disabilities at a statewide agency headquartered in Tallahassee from 1992 to 2001. He grew up in Yulee and currently lives in his childhood home. So everyone please welcome Francis.
Thank you, and welcome to the ramblings of a Yulee kid. Whenever I talk about Yulee, I say, you know, we really need to define what is Yulee. And first of all, I would say that understand that Yulee is not and never has been an incorporated entity. The reason it was called Yulee basically was because it was a railroad stop. It got named Yulee because the railroad was buying land to run their railroad through the area, and one of the people who owned property that they wanted to buy for their roadbed said, yeah, we'll sell you the property, but I want this stop called Yulee after that wonderful senator. And of course this was in about 1890, and the railroad company, like most railroad companies, could have cared less what they called the place. So they said, sure, we'll do that. Prior to that, it was just known as Hart's Road, because Hart's Road from Jacksonville up to the St. Mary's River crossed what I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with is the Yulee Railroad, which went over to the west coast. And so where Hart's Road crossed that railroad, it was called Hart's Road. And that's what the official name of the post office there was for years until the stop got to be called Yulee. So basically, then it became sort of a spot on the map. But how did you define what was Yulee? For me, when I was growing up, my definition of Yulee was fairly simple. Let's see if I can get this to go here. Skip that and go to this. That's the crossroads of Yulee when I was born in 1945, and I'll get into some more of that in a little bit. But basically, to me, Yulee was the next 2 to 3 miles around that intersection. Lots of folks didn't consider themselves to be in Yulee, although I'll also talk a little bit about how they became part of Yulee, and that we had places called Hedges, we had Chester, we had Black Rock, we had O'Neill, we had Nassauville, and some places, and these are sort of still with us in name, and other places that have gone away. There was Hero. And see, my thing is when Wildlife started their thing out there by 95, why didn't they just adopt the name of the area that was already there called Hero? And that's what that area was called at one time. And then we had Becker, Crandall. Crandall was a little bit of a thriving community, mainly because of a sawmill that came in the early 1900s. And then we had Gross. Gross is where 95 crosses 17 as you're going north. Interesting. So, how did we define Yulee? Well, you could go by the post office. The post office of Yulee at one time served from the from the St. Mary's River to the Nassau River, and then up to what was called Black Rock Road, if any of you know where Black Rock Road is. And then to the west, a little ways past where 95 is today. And as you know, some of you know today, the post office from Fernandina also covers what a lot of people consider to be Yulee. Now, the census also designated an area for Yulee, and theirs was a little more expansive. Theirs was basically from the St. Mary's River to the Nassau River to the Amelia River, or where you came over onto the island. But a little bit of background there. Me, as I set up this presentation for the Genealogical Society about a year ago, I guess, maybe. It was based more on my genealogy and when I was born and some more about family. And I was born in 1945, September of 1945. I was born here on Amelia Island, although I'll tell you what, most of the time when I was growing up, I didn't know where Amelia Island was. In other words, when I crossed the river, I was in Fernandina. As far as I was concerned, although I did learn later that, there was an Amelia City. How many of you knew that Amelia City had its own post office at one time? A few of you did, yes. Anyway, I was born at the Nassau County Hospital, which is where that is now a vacant lot on North 14th Street, just after you cross Atlantic. Anyway, I moved to Yulee shortly after my birth and grew up in Yulee. At the time I grew up, my father was the Yulee postmaster. He also owned a general store. And the general store was located, but not there. It was located back this way. If you're familiar with Yulee, this is State Road 200, A1A, and as you go this way towards 95, you'll cross a railroad track. And at the railroad track, just on the other side, are two older buildings on your right. And that is the old store building and also a two-story house that my grandfather had. My family home was right across the street on this side of A1A. Not the two-story house, if you're familiar with that intersection, but the one-story house on the other corner. Anyway, that's where I grew up. Anyway, my father was the postmaster. He was the owner of a general store, and by the way, the post office was in the general store. It was in one corner of the building, and was that way for a number of years. Now, when I was born, the business hub of Yulee was basically here, and this was sort of a crazy intersection. As you see, this is 17. This is 200. You had a spur that ran over here. Interestingly enough, all these spurs were two-lane. They weren't like the cloverleafs we're familiar with today, which are one lane going in a direction, but these were two lanes. If you were coming from the west, from Fernandina, you could make a left turn and go over to 17 here, or you could go to the intersection and turn left. Now, there was no stoplight here. It was a stop sign. We didn't get to be a stoplight community until many years later. And let's see, we may come back to this. Anyway, this was before I was born. This is the building that I have a little antique shop in today, which was the general store building. It was moved in the 70s when they expanded from 2 to 4 lanes. Prior to that, A1A, State Road 200, was a 2-lane road going through here. And My father had a general store here. This was the Hughes property, the two-story house you may be familiar with today. Mr. Hughes had a store downstairs and the family lived upstairs. And as you can see, he had gas pumps. In 1941, which is when we think this picture was made, we had one gas pump. A little bit about the general store. The general store sold everything, my father said. We took care of you from the cradle to the grave. In other words, if you needed baby bottles or diapers, we kept them in stock. If you needed a casket, we would get you one. But we didn't keep them in stock. But we sold everything in between, pretty much. You know, clothing, food, shoes, hardware. Someone earlier today was talking to me about another place that had some local businesses where they did credit. And people would do credit in one building or one business entity for a little while, and then they'd go across the street to another. And we also did credit. Was interesting that we would have people come in on paydays, which was usually at the end of the week, and they would come in and they would give my father a little bit of money, and they would say, well, what's my total bill? But they couldn't pay the total bill. They just could only pay so much. But one day, one of the gentlemen came in and asked my father what the total bill was, and my father added, I think maybe $20 to the bill. Yeah. And so the guy said, well, I can't pay you that much, but I can pay you almost. And so what he did was he then covered the bill. Yeah. And then after he handed my father the money, my father then said, oh, that was all you really owed, and paid on it and handed it to me. He was a little bit flustered at that point. But anyway, these are my two brothers here in the picture. This is Clifford, who was the middle brother, who is no longer with us. This is my brother Joe, who is the oldest of the brothers. And we also have a sister. And she is the oldest. She's the matriarch. Let's see. Coming back to this, it's important in that you had business entities in these little spots here. Interesting. There was a standard station here, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Over here was another little building that had a grocery store in it. And then over here was another gas station. US 17, which came into existence in the 20s, about 1927 was when they opened it up. And that moved the traffic away from where my grandfather and Mr. Hughes had their businesses, because they were sort of the hub for a while, because that's where Harts Road came through what we call Yulee and went on up towards the St. Mary's River. Then when 17 came in, you began to have traffic coming from the north through here. And as I'll show you, that increased the businesses, so to speak, in that we had a number of motels. Anyway, this is that intersection. This is 17, this is 200. And as you can see, there's a line in the middle of these spur pieces that run from the roads around. Quick thing about the standard station here. It was built in 1931, early 31. It was again built because Standard says, hey, we can make money off of these people going up and down the road. And my father and mother got married so they could operate this, because they had made when Standard was going to do this, and whoever was in charge of Standard in the area, my father managed to get in with them, and they were going to want to have someone, of course, to run the station. And this back part here was going to be a garage to work on cars. This picture is probably around 1950, somewhere around there, and this little section was added later. But interestingly enough, this building had family quarters in it, or living quarters in it. Oh, wow. And that's why my father and mother got married and moved there. That's where their first home was in this building, so that they could run the business. Unfortunately, my grandfather died in '32, right after they had moved the store into the building I talked about earlier. And after he died, the situation was such that my father had to take the business over. So when he did, this became available for somebody else. And interestingly enough, it was a first cousin that took it over. And there were floods running this until maybe the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. There were two brothers. One was a James Flood. We called him James E. And he was the person who ran the front part, the gas part. And his brother Jack was the mechanic who did the mechanic work. Step back. When my parents announced that they were going to get married, my grandfather wanted to know, well, why were they getting married? And my father was saying, well, they were going to he was going to take over this business, and he needed somebody to run the front while he worked on the cars in the back. So there you go. As I was saying, here was a small grocery store. At that time, it was called Yulee Grocery. A family by the name of McKendry owned it. And this area in here is where that, what do they call it? I don't know, where Jewel, the barbecue place is, Willie Jewel's and so forth. That's where that is now. Let's see what we have next here. Very important business located. This was north on 17. If you're familiar with Yulee, after you make a right headed towards Georgia, as you cross the railroad track, there is a, I think it's a mobile home or whatever business there now. But this was at one time the Butler's truck stop. And that was a social gathering place for the locals, and needless to say, a place where people could earn a living a little bit. So, not that there was a lot of things to do in Yulee. This is Stillwell Cottages. This was where, if you're familiar again with 17 going north, there's a school plant on the west side of the road. Okay. There's a pine forest motel where this was. Okay. This is the Stillwell Courts, and these were probably built shortly after 17 came into existence. And Mr. Stillwell came in and put these cottages in for people to stay the night and so forth. As you can see, this one car here.
They each had a fireplace?
Yes.
Wow.
Another quick aside, if you were to go to my place in Yulee, where the house is, and actually look behind it, you will see one of those cottages.
Really?
When they closed this out and eventually built Pine Forest, my father made a deal to get one of the cabins, and it got moved to our property, and it was used as storage.
Yeah.
It was used as storage. Still is. Whoops. There we go. Some of what you're seeing now are actually pictures from postcards. You can still buy them on eBay. That's where I got mine. Anyway, Stevens Motel Court. This one was a little bit further south, where Harts Road crossed US 17. Back right after after 17 was built, a Mr. Stevens was going south somewhere. He had some kind of problem and wound up stopping in the Yulee area. And then he decided, you know what? Because of 17, this would be a good place to put a motel. It's 20-something miles north of Jacksonville, so you could possibly get people headed south before they got to Jacksonville, or possibly going north. Another little interesting thing about these cottages made out of concrete block. Mr. Stevens and his son, Mr. Stevens' wife, I think, was deceased at that time. They made all the concrete blocks to construct these cottages.
Wait, Francis, did they build this in the 40s or
It would have probably been in the 30s.
30s? Okay.
This would have been in the 30s. This is a Gulf station. This is a later time. This was actually done after I was born, probably in the early 50s, a Gulf station. This was on that other corner on the west side. There's a Gulf station there. But as you can see, we had motels. We had gas stations. As a matter of fact, I think we had more motels and gas stations out in Yulee than they did on Amelia Island at one time. Wanted you to see the casket invoice.
$18.59. Or
That's
was that
right.
150?
No, $18.50 for that casket. Yep, yep. Yep.
1930.
Yes, they did. Needless to say, lots of folks back in those days didn't do funeral homes. You know, you died, took care of you at the house, got the casket, so on and so forth. Some places, and I imagine that some of the places in Wildlight today have cemeteries where households had, you know, they buried on the property. Anyway, Yulee School, that's where I went to school. I began school there in 1951 in the first grade. I like to tell people, this is the north end of the building. I started here. 12 years later, they let me out. But anyway, this building was one of the let's try to get out of depression organizations built this building. They began it in, I believe, when did I say here? Oh, anyway, 3940, I think, was the first year it was used. My sister, who began school before this was built, watched it being built. And I think she was in the second grade when she got to go to the new school.
Was it first through?
1 through 12, there was no kindergarten.
Oh, okay.
There was no kindergarten. And this was your original building here and the gym. This little piece where the locker rooms were actually added on later.
What's that little thing right there in the middle that going back? Was
This is
cafeteria?
this is your auditorium area, and we would love, those of us who lived in Yulee would love to see this building saved, but I don't know that that's going to happen now. The school board still owns it, but they can't do anything with it because it's not being used for a school, so they can't spend money on it. So any money that gets spent would have to be raised and nothing else otherwise. And this building was the Yulee Methodist Church, later the Yulee United Methodist Church. Little wood frame building.
Is that on 17?
Yes, this is 17 here. Yep. One of the things I like to also make sure everyone is familiar with the fact that Yulee, being in the South, was a segregated community. The black students did not attend this school. At the time I was born, just past where my house was, going down a little bit towards where 95 is today, if any of you traveled that way and noticed there's a little road off to the right called Still Quarters Road. Just a little ways past that, where you get off of there, was where the black school building was at that time in 1945. I'm not sure how many grades they went through, but it was almost a one-room schoolhouse at that time. Then in the early 50s, and I think you've had a presentation just recently on Bryant Academy.
Oral histories, yeah.
And Bryant Academy was the new school for the black community. When I was first doing some research to do this talk, I went and talked with one of the gentlemen I knew who grew up in Yulee, one of the members of the black community. And he was telling about how, he went to Bryant Academy, and when Bryant Academy only went through, I guess, 8th grade. And then if they wanted to go to high school, they had to come over here onto the island. And I think some of you may know of the Peck building. That was the Peck School, which was the all-black school on the island. But they didn't have transportation. They didn't have transportation, so if you were a black student who wanted to further your education, you had to find your own transportation over here to Fernandina. Now for him, it didn't work too badly because you had your two mills here. You had your Rainier, and at that time, what's now I think West Rock, was called Container. Anyway, what he did was he got out, caught him a ride with a pulpwood truck heading into the island, went to school. When he got done, he'd go down to Gum Street at the corner of Gum and 8th and catch him a ride back to Yulee. Interesting. That's what he did. Let's see, what else? And here is an example of the pulpwooding business back when I was coming along. This was an interesting device. This is a blade down here, and this thing could be tilted. To cut the tree down, you had it like that, parallel to the ground. And when you got ready to do shortwood, they did shortwood as we called it in those days. Then once you had it down on the ground, you used the machine like this to cut it into short lengths. And then you loaded it on that truck by hand. And then you hauled it off over here to Fernandina. There you go. And then of course you had to go back and replant. And this is pulled on the back end of a tractor as you go along. Your blade here is cutting your furrow. You just put the thing down, and then the back end of it back here would sort of close it back up.
Oh, cool.
Oops, I keep hitting the wrong button.
Oh,
This was a big event for Yulee, ladies and gentlemen. This was in the early 1950s. This is the intersection I was talking to you about earlier is over here. This is the railroad track. This is 17 coming through here. This is the railroad track of the one that runs to Fernandina. And when Stuckey's came to town, that was a big deal. Yes, it was. So then you could go and get your milkshakes and pecan candies, etc. And of course, again, this was another source of employment for some of the folks who lived in Yulee. Another one, we now know it as the Nassau Holiday Motel. But the Winnie V Motel came in the 1950s, about 1955. He had this fountain built. Matter of fact, if you look real close when you go by there, you can still see the whatever you want to call it, the concrete blocks, et cetera, that made it, the foundation for it, yes. It's still sitting there. But anyway, he got the idea from a fountain that was in LaGrange, Georgia. And LaGrange, Georgia as a lot of you know, in Georgia they had the city square, and in LaGrange they had a fountain, and of course it shot up, and they had the colored lights and all this good stuff. And needless to say, this was a big to-do for us in Yulee too. Here you go. You have this. And so there you go. And it says the state's finest tile baths.
Free television.
And free television. So that tells you also about when this was done. I said it was about 1955, thereabouts.
Yeah.
So we began to have TV in Yulee.
What's that green thing on top?
That was just something to...
Water tower.
It was, probably was neon or something like that.
Yeah.
Just another thing to get your attention, to see that.
And that's still there? It's called the Nassau Holiday?
Nassau Holiday, yes.
Wow.
Yes, these are all still there. And I think it was in the late 50s, there was a 2-story section added on.
Oh.
But up here, as you can't see, is what has been a restaurant and also was a gambling joint for a little while. I'm not sure what they're trying to put in there now. I saw some new sign there the other day. Now, I do not have a picture of it, but another big deal for us was the bringing in of Terminal Paper Bag Company. That was in 53, 54, and it employed about 300 folks.
Wow.
In the area. So needless to say, it wasn't just Yulee folks that worked there. Some who did not work at the mills here on the island came out to Yulee to work at Terminal. People in Yulee worked at Terminal. People even from Callahan and other places around Nassau County came over to work at Terminal. And interestingly enough, there were people who moved to Yulee from places where I think the company had also had operations. Some from Louisiana, some from Alabama. But it was quite a big influx for Yulee, was to bring in Terminal Paper Bag. The building, of course, still exists if you're going south on US 17. After you pass the intersection there, you will see it. It's not exactly the best looking
No, it's not.
place, because actually it sat empty for a number of years. After our technology changed from paper to plastic and so forth, and then they sold it, and then the people who then wound up with the place then gave up doing bags, so they did away with it. Another thing to remember for me is that Yulee did not have many paved roads at that time when I was growing up. Matter of fact, the road in front of my house, I can remember when a short section of Harch Road was paved. That was in the mid-50s. It was also during that time that what we know as Page's Dairy Road today was first paved to some degree. Matter of fact, I didn't even know it was Page's Dairy Road. I mean, most of us who lived around it was just the old road Fernandina, that's what it was called.
Was there a dairy?
Yes, yes there is. Matter of fact, we have a descendant in the audience today whose family had that dairy.
Dr. Page?
No, but his sister.
Angie.
Angie. Yes. Anyway, but yes, Page's Dairy was also a place of employment for folks in the Yulee area. Like I say, there wasn't a whole lot. You had a few people who did a little bit of subsistence farming, but most folks either worked in the pulpwood industry or worked, and when I say pulpwood industry, I mean the whole smear, from the harvesting of trees to coming over here on the island and working in one of the mills. Then of course you had some folks who also participated in your seafood industry, and so forth.
Did you have turpentining?
Yes. Matter of fact, when I said Still Quarters Road,
Yeah.
As you pass where my little shop is, and you pass the Yulee post office, and you hit, as I say, you notice the little road that goes off to the right, which is called Still Quarters Road. And it's called Still Quarters Road because that was where at one time there was a turpentine still. And the reason it's called Still Quarters Road is because there were quarters there for people who worked the turpentine, which again was basically your black community. They did the dirty work.
Yeah, it's hard work.
Like I say, we didn't have many paved roads. We didn't have subdivisions as such. Interestingly enough, where my house is located is actually a platted subdivision thing, but there was never anything like what we know today, where you came in and you divided the property up and you built all these houses and so on and so forth. A fellow by the name of Stillwell did divide that area up into a subdivision, which is on the maps if you look, go to the clerk's office and so forth, or whatever. And but you know, you built your own house if you wanted to buy property there and live there. When I graduated in 1963, there was no I-95.
Old Dixie Highway.
Not in Yulee.
Did you go through there?
No.
Further west.
Further west.
Okay.
A little aside to you on the store that we had, my family had, after World War II ended, General Electric wanted to expand its business. Needless to say, they had been into war production and a lot of stuff. So what they did was they started looking for small businesses that would become GE dealerships. And so my father, he was always adding different various things, he became a GE dealer and was a GE dealer until we closed in 1963. Unfortunately, by the mid-50s, you began to have some of your box stores. And in Jacksonville, there came into existence a company called McDuff Appliances, which sold GE appliances. And McDuff would sell their appliances cheaper than my father could buy them wholesale from GE. But my father, being a fairly intelligent individual, figured out many years ago that anything he sold, he would learn how to fix. And so if you bought a washing machine from Mr. C.A. Flood and you needed it fixed, he'd fix it. But don't buy it from McDuff and call him up and ask him to come fix it. He didn't do that. Another quick little story about my family and my father. Once TVs came out and began he would sell TVs. Well, needless to say, the early TVs had a tendency to not work always, all the time. So they would have to be fixed and worked on. There was a gentleman here on the island, his last name was Reynolds. Anyway, this Mr. Reynolds set himself up to fix TVs. And my father, whenever he had a TV go on the blink that he had sold, he would bring it to Mr. Reynolds to get fixed. And because he would bring it to Mr. Reynolds to get fixed as he was going to the bank over here on the island or doing other stuff that he might need to be doing. And oftentimes he would stop and sort of ask him, well, what are you doing here? And what are you doing there? And so on and so forth. And one day Mr. Reynolds said to my father, Cliff, the TVs you bring me get harder and harder to fix. That was because my father was learning how to fix them himself. So he eventually did that. Matter of fact, it's interesting, one of the fellows that worked for us at the store used to complain about having to clean up the next day after my father had been working on TVs all night or a good part of the evening, and that my father liked to smoke cigars. And there would be cigar butts around and about. The store was an interesting thing. All of the boys in the family worked at the store at some time or other. Of course, my fun time was at Christmas. We sold, like we say, we sold everything. So people would hit us right before Christmas to get bicycles and wagons and things like that. And of course, they wouldn't want to pick them up until Christmas Eve, but they wanted them put together when they picked them up. So we would work on putting bicycles and wagons and things together. On the island, back in those days, Wednesday afternoons were closed days. In other words, they would close at noon or 1. Us in Yulee, or at least at my place, we closed Thursday afternoon. This was when we usually wound up going to Jacksonville to get different things that we needed for the store. In the summer times, one of the things you would get to do for me was Little League. We didn't have Little League that started before school got out as we are today. Our Little League started after school was out. And then there was men's adult softball. Oh boy, that was fun. What was that? Let's see here. Oh, yes. I took this picture about 1955, 56. This is the front of the building here. This is A1A over here. Here's your railroad track. These are some of the local guys hanging around. This is my brother Clifford hiding behind the thing there. And as you can see, we sold GE appliances. We sold milk and ice cream. We sold gas. We sold Standard Oil gas. Some people have asked me, do we still have those pumps? I say no. When we closed in 1963, the Standard Oil Company came and got them. One of the nice things about it was they also dug up the tanks, so we didn't have to worry about that years later.
That's good.
Yes. Here, one of the pastimes, of course, was going drum fishing when drum season came in. And here are a couple of guys. This was my Uncle Raymond. This was a gentleman that worked for my uncle. My uncle, William Henry Flood, W.H. Flood, was a pulpwoodder. He was a person who went out, harvested the trees, hauled them to the mill. And this man here was also one of the folks that worked there, worked for him. For boys at school, we had 4-H. This is my brother Clifford here. This is Dr. David Page's father, David Page, and a number of other folks around here. Let's see. And even this picture, interestingly enough, was probably taken in the 60s. This was right across the street, you know, the two-story house across from where I was. They had still had Miss Hattie Hughes there. Still had her little cauldron that she could, you know, put the wood in here, start a fire going, boil the water, wash the clothes. This is my shop several years ago. This is the two-story house next door. This is where my father grew up. This is also where my oldest siblings, my sister and brother, were born here in that building. It was a store downstairs and the family was living upstairs when my father was growing up. That was prior to the other building being constructed in '31. Here's a 1900 map of Yulee. And as you can see, the things here are not roads, these are railroads. This is your railroad from Fernandina over to Cedar Key, and this was a railroad that came in from the north. This is the one that caused this place to now be called Yulee. My father's family, consisted of Joe Flood, Jane Hall Davis Flood, and another one of my cousins is back there. And he had, these two had these children, Clifford, Jenny, Prudential, and Carolyn, that had lived to adulthood. Now, my grandfather was married prior to my grandmother, but unfortunately, that wife died, along with They had 3 children, and 2 of those children died.
Oh.
And the surviving one was W.H. Flood, or William Henry Flood. And this is my grandfather. This is my Uncle Henry, and that is my father. And this is on the upstairs front porch of that building that I was talking about. And this one I happened to find is someone in front of the building when it was a store downstairs. Young fellow sitting in a wagon there. And this picture was taken a little bit later. As you can see, we now had automobiles. But here is the 2-story house with the store downstairs and some folks there. I'm guessing is seeing as many vehicles there as it might have been on a Saturday. That is the depot, which still stands. This was about the late 1920s when it was constructed. And this is the Hughes house, as I call it, which is across the road there. This was about 1920, or somewhere in the 20s. This building here is a tin building that existed prior to the store building, as I call it, being constructed. Here's one of the fellows. This was a grandson of Mr. Hughes that had the building. And this is your US 17 bridge across the St. Mary's River, which prior to 17 coming into existence, you crossed the river actually to the west a little ways by ferry. That's my father, my mother. The reason I had those pictures was because it was a genealogical presentation to begin with. This is the Yulee School in 1931. It only went to grades 8. The Stevens Motel that I mentioned earlier, this is the son. He later took it over after his father died. And he ran the business until he died. And one of my aunts, my Aunt Carolyn, is there. The rest of the folks, I have no idea. Anyway, there's the intersection again. This picture was taken about 1950s, we think. This was after the store building was constructed. This building had been converted into apartments. This was an open front porch to begin with. This part was closed in to make a little bathroom. A little bathroom and kitchen off of a room upstairs for an apartment. It was divided up into apartments so that my grandmother would have some way of generating an income. And as you can see, the Yulee Post Office, as it says, originally established as Harts Road Post Office, and it was changed to Yulee in December of 1893. And my father was postmaster from basically 1935 until 1972. Wow. Prior to him being postmaster, there was a fellow who was acting postmaster for a brief period of time because this fellow, Edgar H. Flood, who was my father's first cousin, the brother of my grandfather, was the postmaster. And as I showed you the pictures earlier of the 2-story building, again, downstairs in the general store was also the post office in one little corner. Some of you may know of this building here. It's called, Mead's Framery is here. There's a gunsmith here. I'm not sure what's in this right now, but this section right here was the first building in this. This was your first standalone post office in Yulee. Let's see, this section right in here. That was your first standalone post office. And the post office in Yulee today is located pretty much where it was 100 years ago. Let's see. And then in 1883, as you see, there is no railroad going north and south. you had your Yulee Railroad, as we'll call it, going here. It had a spur running over to Jacksonville here. At that time, you had a railroad coming in from this direction through the Callahan-Hilliard area. This picture was taken at Crandall. Crandall was basically a lumber community pretty much in the early 1900s. My grandmother's family, the Davis family, had a sawmill there. These are ocean-going ships that came in here, went on up the St. Mary's River to Crandall to load lumber. And this was one of the Davises. My great-grandfather, William Ploss Davis, his wife. And this is my grandmother, probably in her either late teens, early 20s, something like that. And there's David. And this was in 1863. You had your railroad. Another one, 1864. Let's see. Anyway, that was my grandfather. My great-grandfather, actually. And they lived in St. Mary's primarily until my grandfather, he went to work for the Motel family in Orange Bluff, which doesn't exist anymore, which was on the St. Mary's River. There were basically two sawmills at least located in that area. One the Motel family ran, the other one the Davis family ran. And my grandfather, like I say, he was from St. Mary's. That's where he grew up. Interesting story here in that he went to New York City and apprenticed as a cabinet maker as a young man. And when he came back here, there was no work. So he wound up going to work for the Mozelles at the mill. I mean, at the lumber mill. Anyway, that pretty much wraps up what I have to say. Any other questions? Yes,
I want to find out if we actually live in Yulee. We live off island, off of Amelia Concourse, Flora Park, Northampton, all those zillion subdivisions. We have a Fernandina Beach mailing address. Are we really from Yulee?
It depends on what you want to say.
How did we get to be Fernandina Beach? Because people on the island say, well, you have to pay the taxes. No, we don't pay taxes. Fernandina Beach taxes, even though we have a Fernandina Beach mailing address.
Well, it's like with lots of post office entities, they don't necessarily serve just the incorporated areas in which they are named. Okay. I don't know why historically the Fernandina post office served off island, but when I was growing up, as I mentioned earlier, if you know where Black Rock Road is, excuse me, from there east was served by the Fernandina post office. And of course at that time you basically had, where Lowe's is, I forget the name of the road there.
That is
Barnwell. There we go, Barnwell. Nassauville Road, Scottville as I call it. Off to the north. But Nassauville was served by the Fernandina post office. When they did some expansion, I think the Yulee post office at one time could have acquired some of the area that is now served by the Fernandina post office, but the person who was postmaster of Yulee at that time, when approached about expanding to that area, did not want to do that. So that's how Fernandina got to that. Plus, there were also some folks who wanted a Fernandina address. Okay, there was another one here. No? Yeah.
I did want to ask about the population of that area when you were growing up in the 50s. 300 people, 600, 1,000?
Oh, maybe 300. It was small. The building that the school was originally built, Cole, was 300 students. So if you can sort of figure it from there, and that was encompassing more than just Yulee. At one time, well, I guess it still does today, it encompassed from the bridge west up to the St. Mary's River, Nassau River, somewhat on the other side of where 95 is today. And if you were going to Hilliard and took what we call 108, it was also part of that,
Wow.
maybe about halfway. And I forgot to mention Evergreen and Sandhill. Yes.
I'm D.W. Terrell's granddaughter, so I've heard the family all my life and everything. I just want to throw this in there. David Page's, he would miss a school bus just so he could ride his horse to school. I have a horse up near the school, but that was just a cute thing I had heard about in the years.
I would also add to your story a little bit, not necessarily about David, but the building that's there by the school property, part of the lumber came from some of the buildings down at Crandall when it was constructed. Because by then it was Crandall was basically disappearing. Yes.
You said you graduated in 1963. Was that the last school, class to graduate from the Yulee School at that time?
65 was.
It was 65, so
Yes.
and they came to Ferndale?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
One more question. Your Uncle Henry, you got an Uncle Henry Flood. Was his wife Louise Owens Flood?
Yes.
Okay, I know
Yes.
her very well. Okay.
Yes. She
I
was
find
a,
everybody's
She
related
made
to
great
everybody.
She made great pound cakes.
yes. She made wonderful pound cake. And the brother that I'm talking of, that I mentioned earlier, who's no longer with us, Clifford, he got Aunt Louise's recipe and did his best in his later years to try to replicate that pound cake.
How
And
did he do?
he came pretty close.
I don't see it in any cookbooks or on YouTube.
My brother Clifford's wife Sue wanted to get the recipe and asked Aunt Louise, where's your recipe? And she just sort of looked at her like, well, I do this, I do this. So what Sue had to do one day was actually stay there with her as she was putting the cake together to write down everything. And she was good at that, let me tell you. So that's how we do have a recipe somewhere. And if you want a recipe, get in touch with me. I think there's one stuck somewhere. Yes.
Francis, Barnabas just took over the old antique shop in the corner, not too far from what you're talking about.
Yes.
Does that building have any significance and similar to all the history in Yulee?
Yes.
That you know of?
Yes. If you remember the picture of the crossroads where the little building was across from the Standard Station?
Yeah.
That was a little grocery store. Sometime in the early 50s, I'm not sure whether Mr. Fulford was the owner. He had the grocery store. I don't think he owned the property, but that building was constructed in the early 50s. It was constructed to be a banner food store, and that was a grocery store there to begin with. I think they also had some extra little slots on it to rent out and stuff. Later, a family named Akel bought the building and property, and they continued to run the banner food store, and they had a little bit of a living section there and for a while. But that was a banner food store for a number of years, and then later it became an IGA store. And then later the building back where Starting Point is was constructed to house the grocery store. Any other questions? Yes.
You said your family general store closed in '63?
Yes.
But your father continued to be the postmaster for another 10 years, is that right?
Yes.
And that was at the brick building that's where the Mead Spring?
Yes.
And how
Yes.
long was it, was that a post office?
Let's see, he retired in '72. It would have been sometime in the mid-'70s. It was moved. I passed the building just the other day. I think they're selling golf carts there now. If you make if you're heading south on 17 from A1A,
Yeah, you're right, yeah.
that was
By the
the,
bowling alley.
right, yes.
Yeah.
That was the second
Okay.
standing alone post office compared to the one that's there today,
Okay.
which is actually too small. It was amazing. When my father retired as postmaster, there was one route. It's in the teens now.
Oh, yes.
They don't come by railroad that drop. I only heard they came from Callahan to Fernandina, but they would stop at the flood store. Is that correct?
I don't know about that route. When I was growing up, a lot of your mail was transported by train. A drop-off point was in Yulee for Yulee and Fernandina. Wish I had pictures of that. But there used to be, some of the trains didn't stop. They just picked up mail. In other words, on the side of the track was this contraption where they would hook a bag. As they went by, they would put a lever out that stuck out and caught that bag and hook it back in. And then the guys on the train, on that car, would sort mail as it went by. I can remember back some really long nights in that my father was postmaster and he would have to pick up the mail from the trains, but sometimes you would have, like our storms that we're all worried about right now, sometimes there would be storms that would take place and would create problems for the trains. And it didn't matter that the train didn't come at its usual time of, say, 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. And we would have to sit, my father would sit there and wait and wait and wait until the train finally came in and stopped so he could get the mail off of it. I can remember sitting in the car with him, just sitting there. Any other questions? Yes.
Was the Hughes store a general store like that?
Yes, it was.
They didn't rent rooms or anything like that?
No, that was done later.
Done later.
That was done later, just like with my grandmother's house. When Mr. Hughes died, what they did was they then divided that, they did away with the store, divided it, the bottom up into 2 apartments, and the front porch was then enclosed, the one by the street was enclosed, and that was an apartment as well. Ms. Hughes continued to live upstairs. But that's where most of the school teachers lived when they came to Yulee, when they were young school, fresh out of college, teaching school in Yulee. They either rented an apartment at my grandmother's or rented an apartment over at Mrs. Hughes's. Matter of fact, the apartment on the front northeast corner, we used to call a marrying apartment because it was oftentimes rented to young women that came to teach, and usually within a year or so they were married. Yes.
Is there any preservation movement to take the house and restore it, or?
Not that I'm aware of.
I mean, nothing.
I did look into what it would cost to do some work on that house and said, my. Moving right along. Moving right along. Yes.
What about the old cemetery there? Do you have any history on the whole cemetery in Yulee near the railroad tracks? You know what I'm about?
The Hughes Cemetery.
That's right.
The Hughes Cemetery, again, the Mr. Hughes that we were talking about here, that family owned property in that area, and that's probably where some of their family members were first buried, and then it just got expanded out to become sort of the Yulee Cemetery for that area. And interesting, back in those days, a lot of the houses were built along the railroad tracks facing the railroad. If you look closely, you notice that the building, the 2-story building, was actually the front porch of it looks out towards the railroad. Anything else? Thank you.
Maybe one of our board members is going to talk a little bit about our oral history.
Oh, I'm not gonna
Just
talk,
mention-
I'm just gonna make an announcement. You'll be glad to know that our Heritage Keepers project, which is a project to get as many oral histories on tape as we can for our archive. Our archivist, Rhonda's back there, and she's doing a bang-up job. As soon as we get those recordings in, we get them transcribed, and then they go up online, and you can listen to them, and we've got quite a few that are done. We've got a long list of people to be interviewed, but you'll be glad to know Francis is one of our interviewees, and so we've got him on tape. And then with Summer, with doing the presentations, these are recorded also, and so they will go into the archive. So we're trying very hard to get as much history as we can. As you know, when a person dies, the library burns to the ground. So, and as you can tell from this hour, I learned a lot. And so, and as we go up. So if you all do know of people who might need to be interviewed, we're glad to hear from you. Either get a hold of Summer or Rhonda here at the museum and let us know, because we are, or if you would like to be involved with interviewing people, we train people to go out, and it's very easy. This is the recorder. That's as big as it is. Tiny little thing. Not like what we used to have. When I began in this business, it was like a giant reel-to-reel tape recorder. And we'd love to have as many interviews as we can, and we'd be glad to work with y'all. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all for coming and stay dry.
Very good.